In this video, we're going to go over the wall quad stretch, or the couch stretch. And the purpose of this stretch is to stretch out the front of the hip, specifically a muscle called the rectus femoris, which is a quad muscle that connects from the front of the pelvis to the knee. We're going to go over the technical cues, how to do it properly, and then more importantly, how to effectively load this stretch so we can get the most adaptations possible and actually make progress in this stretch. I'm going to cover a few different ways that I commonly see people do this stretch incorrectly. Not necessarily that it's incorrect, but just they perform the stretch in a way that doesn't allow for progression to occur over time. People come to me and they say they've been doing the couch stretch for years and it just hasn't gotten any better. We'll get into why that is. So first and foremost, let's talk about some anatomy. So you have this quad muscle, the rectus femoris. It flexes the hip and it also extends the knee. So the proximal component of the muscle, as it originates at the front of the hip, will perform hip flexion and anterior pelvic tilt. The distal portion of the muscle will extend the knee. So think leg extension machine, that is strengthening the rectus femoris muscle. So when we want to stretch this muscle from both the origin and the insertion, we need to extend the hip and also flex the knee. Now, that being said, we can focus on one portion of the muscle, whether it's the proximal portion or the distal portion, in different stretches and strengthening exercises that we choose. Now, for the purpose of this exercise, the wall quad stretch, in my opinion, we should use this stretch to focus more on the proximal aspect of this muscle, getting into more of the hip flexor component of it. Now, of course, it'll also help stretch some of the other hip flexors like the psoas and the adductors, but with this knee bent, it's going to primarily bias the rectus femoris. So let's get into how I commonly see this done and how we can make it better. A lot of coaches like to use the knee perfectly against the wall as a standard for how we should set up. So I see people who are very limited in hip extension set up with that knee and shin perfectly flushed to the wall, but they can't get upright. They're stuck here. So then oftentimes we'll see this, is people will just spend time here because they don't want to overly arch the back. They want to keep the pelvis neutral. And now they're just going to try to extend the hip from this position. Now, this is fine, but it doesn't allow for any progressive overload, right? We have zero leverage here to get this hip toward the ground. Whenever we're doing a stretch and we want to turn it into a loaded stretch, one that we can progress over time, we need gravity working directly with the load to help facilitate a deeper stretch. So in this case, the moving joint is going to be the hip into extension, right? So we want gravity acting down on the back of the hip to push the hip in extension. And the weight of the body, the upper body, is going to be that external load. So we want the torso vertical first and foremost, so we get that load going through the back of the hip. And we don't want to be hunched over because now we have zero load going through the hip joint into extension outside of gravity. We want gravity working with the external weight. So when we actually want to load this stretch and use external weight in the form of dumbbells or kettlebells or barbells, we want to keep this upright torso position. So what do? If we're too tight to even get into this position? We're going to scoot the knee forward. Okay, so now we have a bit more room to extend that hip. So now we can keep the torso more upright and then start to get gravity helping us a bit more to push that hip down and forward into extension. Now, another option is we can elevate this knee on a yoga block or a stack of pads. Now, this elevation gives us a little bit more clearance because now we can keep the pelvis a bit more neutral longer as we extend the hip. So this extra bit of femoral extension will allow this femur to get a little bit more parallel with the ground so we can have gravity acting downwards again. What happens with the knee on the ground here is it actually requires a bit more flexibility to get the most out of it because the distance from this knee to this knee is greater and this hip is pushed into more flexion earlier. So as we sink this hip down, this hip moves into more flexion. Once we run out of flexion on this hip, it's going to facilitate that posterior pelvic tilt, which from a pelvic standpoint is hip extension as well. So if the pelvis is extending while the femur is extending, now we're going to have less overall excursion through the range from the femur. So elevating this knee on 1 or even 2 yoga blocks will give us more of that femoral extension while keeping the pelvis a bit more neutral for longer. Another common way I see this stretch done is instead of people trying to extend the hip forward, they just simply move their torso further and further back. So not that this is bad, but what this is doing is it's now shifting the stretch to more of the distal component of the muscle. So it's stretching more of the knee extensor component of the muscle because now we're moving into further knee flexion. But I just find the wall quad stretch isn't the most effective way to target that portion of the muscle. I would much prefer to use something like a reverse Nordic curl or a version of the wall quad stretch I like to call the recliner couch stretch, where I have a video tutorial on this already, but we just move that knee further out. We can even do this on an incline bench, and then we lean back from here, trying to get the butt closer to the heel, and then we can drive our foot through the wall to come back out. Because if we're applying force with the foot into the wall, we want the weight of the body, which is the external load in this case, to be moving against gravity. In this position, the force directed through the foot is pushing me this way. So the top of my body is not working against gravity. Okay, we would need to have the shins fixed on the ground and then move the torso toward the ground. Now when I apply this pressure with the foot into the ground, that is a much more effective way to build length and strength through the rectus femoris muscle in more of this distal component. So when we're using this couch stretch, the wall quad stretch, I find it's best to focus on the hip extension component. So let's get into how to load the stretch effectively and make more lasting range of motion gains. Okay, let's go over the first technique, which is going to be a contract, relax, agonist, contract. When we start to add external load via dumbbells or kettlebells overhead and held by the sides, we're not going to get the most out of those until we can fully understand how to contract the muscle we're trying to stretch in the end range position and then also pull ourselves deeper using the opposing muscles. So this is how I go about it. I'm going to use the block elevation to allow myself to get more hip extension. I always like to use some sort of hand support here to facilitate greater intensity when I apply these isometric contractions to get the upper body involved as well, and of course create some stability so we're not relying on balance. Okay, so I'm going to shimmy this leg out so I have space to extend. Okay, I'm going to squeeze my butt, push the hip forward. Now, once I find a good stretch, the first contraction is going to be simultaneously pressing my foot into the wall while also dragging my knee forward. Okay, so I'm pushing through knee extension and hip flexion. So I'm going to generate a pretty strong isometric contraction for about 10 to 15 seconds. I'm going to take a big inhale. Relax. On the exhale, just let my body go where it wants to go. And then I'm going to actively contract into further hip extension. So what I like to do is think about dragging my knee up the wall, my knee and shin up the wall. And that's pushing my hip into more extension while also really firing the glute. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, around 10 seconds there. Relax that. Now I might try to reset a bit, shimmy this foot a bit forward, see if I can get that hip a little bit more forward. Okay, during the contraction of the rectus femoris, I'm pushing the knee forward, foot into the wall. I can even crunch the abs as well. Relax. Now I'm going to really extend, get everything extending. I can even get the low back helping with that glute contraction as well. So really trying to send the shin up the wall. Okay, thinking about pushing with the heel upwards, like I'm doing a glute kickback type of motion, or I'm trying to lift my knee off the block. I find that's a much better cue than just saying squeeze the glute and push the hip forward. Okay, so repeat that 2 to 3 cycles. The next variation is overhead or back rack. So I'm going to explain. I want to go basically as heavy as my shoulders can handle here, and heavy enough to allow me to fully relax into the stretch. If I'm shaking and sweating and having trouble breathing, you're going too heavy. So I'm going to clean the dumbbell up, the kettlebell up, hold it overhead. I want to make sure the back of the kettlebell aligns with the back of the pelvis here. Okay, a lot of times people hold the weight up here and it's not doing what it needs to do because now the weight is moving in front of the hip. We need the weight moving a little bit behind the hip to allow gravity to act on the weight more effectively. Okay, so same cues apply. Extend the hip forward, get the torso upright, drive the knee forward and through to come out of it. Okay, we don't want to just push ourselves back with this leg. We want to think about driving that knee forward into the ground, pushing through hip flexion. Extend, so hip extension to stretch, hip flexion to come out of it. As I extend out, I want to think about pulling that foot up the wall like we did in the contract, relax, agonist, contract method, and then drive the knee forward to come out of it. So we're pulling ourselves deeper, contracting the stretch muscle to come out of it. So we'll do this for reps, and then with a final hold, pushing that knee down into the ground isometrically. So if you start to get tired, or your shoulders just aren't strong enough, just relax the kettlebell on the back of the shoulder here, okay? And we could get the same thing out of it. What I will say about this is you'll probably be able to handle a bit more heavier weight than fully overhead. The overhead load is nice because it's a longer lever, so lighter weight feels heavier. In this case, we could go a bit heavier if we can get the weight up. So sometimes using a dumbbell works, or you can even put a whole barbell on your back. Now, another way I like to load this would be the suitcase method. This helps keep your ribs down a bit more, whereas overhead kind of allows the torso to extend to facilitate more of that global extension. Here we could be a bit more isolated and allow the weight of the dumbbells to pull the upper ribs down just to really focus on that hip extension component. So we can grab the weights, hold them by the side. Same thing. And now this variation allows us to go a bit heavier. Sometimes it's nice to use this variation with a bit of extra elevation on the knees. So maybe I would go with 2 yoga blocks here, sometimes even 3. This is providing a nice front of the hip stretch, allowing me to keep that posterior pelvic tilt a little bit easier. Sometimes people feel very lopsided with the couch stretch, and one hip is a bit more hiked and they feel uneven. So a lot of times I'll like to give people ipsilateral variations, which basically just keeps this front hip a bit more stable and allows us to actually focus in on this hip. And now what this ipsilateral weight does too is it helps turn me toward this side. A common compensation with hip extension is the pelvis rotates toward the same side and this foot will move inward. And now we start stretching the anterior capsule, we start stretching more of the groin tissue. We don't really want that. So this ipsilateral weight will help facilitate a nice turn and a side bend component as well. So we can actually get a little bit more into the psoas, but it also helps keep us in that sagittal plane, meaning we're not rotating toward that way, we're just staying straight forward as we extend the hip. The problem with the contralateral grip here, meaning just the weight held on the same side, is it forces this hip, this glute medius, to work way harder to stabilize. And now this weight kind of wants to turn me this way. Kind of just becomes like a core exercise. We don't want that. I much prefer the ipsilateral grip. Okay, last variation, and probably the more advanced. I'm starting to make a mess with all these different weight implements. I was actually meant to do 4 sets of these today in my own training, so it's nice. Each set has been a different variation. The contract relax, overhead, suitcase, and now barbell. So when we're using the barbell, we can load this up as heavy as we want. And we can basically use these as either a progression to the overhead or a progression to the suitcase. Back rack, a little bit tricky to get overhead. More ideal if you have this in a squat rack that you can just take off the rack and then use a bench for your foot so you're not using a wall. So this kind of acts just like the kettlebell would overhead or resting on the same side shoulder. Now what we can do here is get the lats involved, really pull the elbows down, engage the upper and lower back to help facilitate that hip extension. Okay, I like to shimmy this leg out a bit more to give my hip a bit more space to extend. I'll even externally rotate it and abduct it to give a little bit more room for hip flexion. And I'll even turn the barbell to help square the pelvis a bit. Okay, so one of my favorites for really getting a deep stretch. Okay, alternatively, we can use the under leg grip like this to kind of mimic the suitcase variation. Get the upper body involved as well. Really think about pulling the shoulder blades back. And again, you can load these as heavy as you want. So a barbell eventually is a nice way to progress if you have access to it. So those are my favorite variations for loading the wall quad stretch. One of the most effective ways to improve hip extension and flexibility of these quad muscles. I like to train this particular exercise twice a week. One, more high reps, lighter weight. The other day, lower reps, heavier weight, really focusing on getting as deep of a stretch as possible and really applying that intensity. If you want to see how I program some of the more beginner variations of the couch stretch, I highly suggest you check out my Supple Hips program. This program encompasses every single direction the hip moves through, improves hip rotation, hip flexion, hip extension, as well as hip abduction. So if you want hips that move good all the way around, check it out. In the meantime, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And if you try out any of these variations, let me know in the comments. Stay supple.